Okay. Same here. Backward, forward here.
Hello everybody. I have the honor and privilege to introduce Sri Mohan Guru Swami Ji, who has kindly come all the way from Delhi to Dharamsala. Not necessarily the first time, but at least first time during my time. And efforts made by TPPRC and with Tibet Policy Institute. I would like to extend, as we say in India, heartfelt greetings. And the weather is warm, but warm greetings as well to you. And as you all know, Mohan Guru Swami Ji is a very well-known China specialist, not just in India, South Asia, but throughout the world, because he has traveled from India to Moscow, to DC, to Paris, across the world. He is much sought after speaker and a specialist on various issues, and he has a very interesting background. Actually, he majored in mathematics and physics and chemistry, but I think he liked the chemical component of geostrategic issues that later he studied public policy and international affairs and management. And then he's a fellow alum from Harvard Kennedy School. So today actually our honorable speaker was supposed to introduce Mohan Guru Swami Ji, and I insisted that I should have this privilege because his daughter Menaka Guru Swami is a very good friend of mine. We were together at Harvard Law School, and also both of us were selected as the Young Asian Leaders by Asia Society. So just 2 weeks ago, I was having tea with her, and I said, you should come to Dharamsala, and she promised that she will come with her father. Then she told me, actually it's Mohan Guru Swami Ji, and then realized that what an honor it is. And then yesterday I called her that your father is coming, and what about her? And she is advocate in the Supreme Court of India. She also travels around the world. She's a Rhodes Scholar. She just completed her doctorate degree from Harvard, and she worked at the UN for very long, and she's also a gold medalist. So I insisted that I have the privilege, because I have to show my face to Menaka, that I treated her father with some civility, at least not only I met him, but also introduced him to you all. And then he was an advisor in the Indian Foreign Ministry with the rank of a secretary. And then now he heads the Center for Policy Alternatives in Delhi, which actually deals with critical and uncomfortable policy. So in a sense, he is quite also a specialist in scenario planning or war scenarios, so future crisis. And he told me that he was one of the main actor or the player in post-Dalai Lama scenario for Tibetan people in Tibet. So he has done all that, what we should be doing. And then very interesting issues. And then, as I told you, he has published many books and articles, from looming crisis in India's agriculture to India issues in development, India's role, ACES in foreign policy and security issue, and to our interests, India-China relations, the border issue and beyond. Now, recently he has published a book called Chasing the Dragon, Will India Catch Up with China? So you have to imagine our royal elephant chasing the dragon of China. And he has also written an internal security issue monograph on Jammu and Kashmir. And as as I said, he has traveled around the world, and he is a frequent speaker in international forums, particularly in Indian media. So anyone who watches major Indian television would have seen Guru Swamiji touting his knowledge and expertise and wisdom on India, China, and Tibet issue. And he has also been to Tibet quite freely, to several places in Tibet, from Lhasa to Shigatse to Xining, and he has also taken the train ride. So not only he is a specialist on China, but keenly interested on the issue of Tibet. And if I may add, quite a frequent visitor to Dharamsala, but of late, it's been a few years he has not been here. So the fact that he is here means he'll visit us more and then share with us. And then obviously he will be sympathetic and supportive of the Tibet issue. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Mohan Guru Swamiji, and then as you note, our members of parliament are here, and senior staff members of CTA are here. So that means CTA is also keenly interested in what you have to say. So the topic, India versus China, on the issue of Tibet. So you can clearly see, I can see dragon and a tiger. I thought the elephant will represent India better. Now you brought Bengal tiger there. So let's see which one will go ahead, which one will get ahead. Not now, but in years to come. And especially he gave the year of 2020 as something very interesting for China and India. So with that, please welcome to Dharamsala, and the floor is yours. Please give him a big hand.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Sangye. Ladies and gentlemen, coming to Dharamsala is like coming back home. You have come here so often, and I'm with people I consider my friends, and I've never received such a warm welcome from anybody before. And normally what happens is when you're invited to speak, you're introduced, and I always call the introduction the obituary, because that's how an obituary in a newspaper reads. That he did this, and he died yesterday. So, but you added a human element to it, and it was heartwarming, and I really felt very happy to get this kind of an introduction. So, before I get digressed, I'll tell you a story I told him 10 minutes ago, that in 1987, shortly after, a few years after I graduated from Harvard and came back to India, I went to visit the United States, and I went to a town called Minneapolis in Minnesota. And there was a Harvard Club gathering, and at that gathering there were 30-40 people, and I saw a young lady sitting by herself. So I walked up to her and I said, "Are you also a Harvard graduate?" She said, "No." Then I said, "What do you do?" She said, "I am the representative of the Ukrainian Liberation Front in the state of Minnesota." I said, "Are you real? Are you serious?" She said, "Yes." And I said, "Before me, my father was a representative." And this was 1987. In 1987, the Soviet Union looked invincible. It was challenging the United States missile for missile and tank for tank. And 1990 it collapsed. I was in Russia a few months before it collapsed. When I came back and I told people in the Indian embassy that things are not good here, nobody believed it. But the importance therefore is that one lady in Minneapolis holding a candle and keeping it burning, dozens of people like that all over the world, hundreds maybe, holding that candle, you keep a nation alive. So, it's not a question of in your lifetime or my lifetime, but you're keeping that candle alive. As long as that candle is burning, Tibet is alive. So I think this is very important, and I thought I must tell you that, Second point I made to His Excellency earlier was that India and China have been around for about 5,000 years, 6,000 years, depending on who you believe. And both have survived this period as civilizational entities. Both have survived. And both in the year 1670, 1620 actually, India and China were the world's greatest economic powers. Together they controlled almost 70% of the world's GDP. And the next 300 years they just kept dropping. In 1950, India and China together had only 5% of the world's GDP. And from 50, both these two countries have begun to rise again. A little faster, a little slower. India has been ahead from 50 to about 1978 or so. India was actually bigger than China in GDP. And then Chinese took over. And now we are seeing another race again joining in. But civilizationally, the two countries, long histories, long big populations, will have not fought. And I keep telling my Tibetan friends that they will not fight for another nation. Because they have... And you know, Tibet in the scheme of things becomes too small. So therefore, it's important for Tibetans to fight, their own fight. You know, and that is important. That, you know, if any Indian tells you, I'll come and fight for you, don't believe him. If any government comes and tells you, don't believe it. You must fight your own fight. You must be prepared for your own fight. You know, the Bhagavad Gita says that, you know, be prepared and to do your duty, because in doing your duty alone is the reward. There is nothing, no other greater reward than that. So, you know, with that little this thing, I'll get back to my story today. What happened?
I think you can just press one button here. Enter.
Okay, enter.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Story of these two countries. In 1962, when India and China went to war, the Indian per capita GDP was twice China's. And yet India got defeated. So one important relationship there. The GDP has nothing to do with power. GDP is an economic indicator. Power is something else. And willingness to use force is something else. Okay. What's next?
The next button. That one, yes.
This one?
No, other one.
Can you please help me? Oh, just here. Okay, all right. Okay. This one? Which one?
No, no,
This one?
yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
This is the story of the two countries right now. Together we have 19% of the world's GDP and 38% of the world's population. And you can see this chart is from the year 2000, how India and China have been growing. Both have been going upwards, but China has been on a higher trajectory than India. That's very clear. And as a consequence, the nominal GDP has gone up much higher than India's. So China today is 3 times as big as India in terms of the economy. And what is happening is today China is saving more and investing more in itself and elsewhere. India's growth is capital short. We need savings, other people's savings. We don't have money. And we come to a stage when you have to grow, you need money. So, you know, the second relationship. Money, who has got money doesn't matter. Money goes where it gets a return. China has the money. So India is going to get Chinese money to invest here. United States invested in China. They don't like the Chinese very much. Japanese dislike the Chinese intensely and vice versa. But Japan is the biggest investor in China and the biggest trading partner in China. So how money goes has nothing to do with political likes and dislikes. Money goes where it gets a return. So Chinese money is being invited, and Chinese money will come because India offers a good rate of return. So you all should see this. Tomorrow Xi Jinping will say 200 billion, 100 billion. That shouldn't bother you. Saying that we say the more money comes in, the better. He'll behave better. Chinese economy, as you can see, has contained this deficit below 3% of GDP. Our deficits are high, sometimes have gone as far as at 10%. So economically, there is a case for India to take Chinese money. Who has the money in the world? Only China and Japan have money. China has $4 trillion, Japan has $1 trillion in American banks. America doesn't have any money. America has only $72 billion as reserve. India has got $400 billion as a reserve. So Indian reserves are bigger than American reserves. Germany doesn't have reserves. Britain doesn't have. Their companies have money. Companies can invest money, but when companies invest money, it's short-term money. You know, it comes for 10 years and goes away. But when you invest in infrastructure, you are going to, if you build this road from McLeodganj to Dharamsala, the return on that road is to be over the next 40 years. So it's a long-term investment. Who has long-term investment? Only governments have. So which is why the Chinese government is very important to the Indian government at this moment in time. And this is something which, as the interested third party, you all must understand. And this current account balance is China. You know, I can keep on showing you more charts that China has been doing better than India. China exports twice as much as India. It's more globalized with the world. China is America's biggest trading partner, is Japan's biggest trading partner. China has a trade surplus of about $350 billion a year. Comes to China. And what do they do with the money? It puts it in American banks. And what do the Americans do? They go off to Iraq and Afghanistan and spend that money. You know, so this is the relationship. Economists in the US say the relationship between China and America is that of a drug addict and a drug peddler. So the drug addict needs more drugs, so the drug peddler gives them more drugs and says, okay, I'll add it to your account. So, you know, the Americans are consuming and the Chinese are giving money. Chinese are giving money because there's nowhere else they can give money to right now. Till countries like India come along and say, okay. Till now, India said no to Chinese investment. We said, you know, slow down, we're not so slow. But now I think time has come when India has to open up. There's a trade relationship between India and China of about $80 billion a year. As you can see, we are mostly exporting primary goods, iron and steel, 35%, others, iron ore, minerals and stuff like that. Mostly, we are a low-grade exporter to China, low value-added exporter. And this is what, India's imports from China. So we are importing machinery, etc. And this is what we are exporting. 58% is iron ore and materials. So these are different countries completely. Compared to China, we are a developing country. We have the profile of a developing country. But we both have a similar problem. Both of us are dependent on oil from abroad. 70 to 80% of our oil is imported. And this is where India's first big advantage comes. And this is what worries the Chinese the most. That all those oil lanes which go from the Gulf, from Africa, they go 300 kilometers from the Indian coast. So we're sitting on the coastline. We've got a big navy, we've got a big air force, we're sitting there. So, you know, so India has the ability to open a new front. So, not that we will open it, but the Chinese should know that we can open it. And that is important. So, you know, in strategic geopolitics, we don't actually go and throw stones at somebody. We say, I've got enough stones in my pocket, you know, and I can throw it at you. So, you know, this is a geopolitical indicator that, you know, we can open a second front at you. This is Chinese money. It's accumulating. This was a chart made in 2007. They almost had 3 trillion then. And India is 300 billion. China is like a man with diabetes. Got too much of good life, too much of rich food, there's too much of sugar in the blood. And the money he can't use. Because if he takes the money back to China, some people say, why can't the Chinese take the money back? If you take the money back to China, you will have hyperinflation. It'll be too much of money. So he can't swallow the money. It's lying outside. So Americans are using it. And the Americans know the Chinese are in difficulty. They say, okay, we'll give you 0% interest, no interest. And the dollar is depreciating at 4% a year. So Chinese money, that $4 trillion, in 25 years in theory, can become dust. So what do the Chinese do? They're worried. They're looking for places to put money where they will get a return. When you're looking for places to put, who do you see? You see the biggest country in the region. Both of us have shown declines in foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP, though our GDPs have gone up, and in real terms the foreign direct investment has gone up. Okay, so China is looking at India for investment places. China needs to invest money into India. Now, you know, when I was studying economics first, maybe 45 years ago, the economic teacher told me, I remember very clearly, he said, if a cow has a calf, the GDP has gone up. But if a woman has a child, then it's adding to our economic problems. So when I asked the professor, I said, sir, how can the calf be adding to GDP and a human child becoming an economic problem? He said, no, don't ask these questions. Don't have children. Children are bad. They're a nuisance, they consume, they're noisy, they're dirty, you know, children are not good. And when I was studying in college, there was a man called Paul Ehrlich. He was a professor at Stanford. Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Coming Hunger Crisis. And his book starts very apocalyptically. On page 1 it says, imagine the year 2000 and you are walking in the central district of Delhi in Connaught Place. You will see people falling off and dying of hunger. So, you know, this was in 1964 I came across. So at that age, I was not anxious to look at 2000, because I said 2000, people will be dying in the thousands and every day. We can't feed people. But mankind has an ability to fix its problems. We had the Green Revolution, we produce more food. You don't see Indians dying of hunger. India has got 68 million tons of food grains in the godowns, and we are exporting some also, so you know. But we grew up in that scenario, and therefore if you have more children, it is bad. Because every child will want more food. So we grew up in that scenario. But now what is happening is, we are saying that human beings are economic factors of consumption, economic factors of production, economic factors of saving. So if more human beings are better. So more human beings mean more consumption, more savings, more production, more of everything. So we've come to a new stage in economics. Economists are notoriously short-sighted people. They have to have the event descending on their head and hit them hard, then they'll say, okay, now this is what happened. So now we are all agreeing that country is people and people are important. Second important thing is urbanization. The more people you urbanize, the more rapidly you grow, and China is urbanizing. India is now following behind urbanizing. By 2030 or so, India will be 60% urban. Now, Dharamsala, when I first came here, was a small village in the 60s. It was a small village. It was nothing. Today it's a town. It's a city. An airport and all that, and all the wherewithal. McLeodganj just had 4 shops here. The Prestonji's shop, Nauroji shop, and just down the spine of the hill you went to the Dalai Lama's home. You know, there's nothing there. Look at McLeodganj now. So, and which means that what has happened, prosperity has come to McLeodganj. Prosperity has come to Dharamshala. Which means that urbanization increases prosperity. Both India and China are rapidly becoming urban. Now this is where the difference between India and China is coming up. You look at the working age number of people. In 2000, India had 600 million working people, and in 2010, it has about 750. In 2000, China had about 650, and it has only grown up to about 750. It's not grown up much. But what happens is, if you go further down, China's population starts growing, starts dropping. And I'll show you these figures. Now, this is the population projections for India. 1.2 billion now. In 2050 it will be 1.565 billion. Mind you, the government of India told the UN population this thing, that UN said, when are you going to stop growing? So government of India said, by 2030 we will stop growing. We are going to stop growing at 1.3 billion. And that is, say, zero growth. But the good news in India is that our people don't listen to the government. We do what we want. So we are having children, and it's going up. Now they are saying that more population is good. But the news is that it is not stopping at 2050 either. I've done a large paper on the demographic projection of India. It grows to 2090 and stops at something like 1.8 billion. So it's going to be a young, youthful, consuming nation, producing, eating, drinking, saving, needing lots of things, having babies. So, and look at what happens to China. China is frozen. What is happening here? 1.3 billion, 1.3 billion. That means number of old people are going up. So China has now got a walking sticks problem. If you want to manufacture something in China, you must manufacture walking sticks. Because there are more old people, they will need walking sticks, So we say it's going from walking on the road without having gone into the automobile age, it's going to the walking stick age. So Chinese themselves say we are becoming rich, we are becoming poor, we are becoming old before we become rich. So this is a problem which China has. Now I'll illustrate my thesis with a statistic figure here. This was Japan in 1950, the first islet, pyramid like that. 35% below the age of 15, 60% below the age of 65, and 5% above the age of 65. What happens in 2006? 13% below, 20% on top, and 65% in that middle age tending upwards. What happens in 2050? Japan is going to have a lot more old people. And old people don't consume, they don't spend, they only have savings. That is the profile of an old person. That's my profile. For instance, when a couple of months ago when I wanted to buy a new car, my wife said, "Why do you want to buy a car? How long will you use it?" So this question arises to everybody at long stage. Why? He wants to save money because he might need a new kidney, or a heart operation. So you're not spending anything. You're keeping the money in the bank. You're not giving it to your children either to spend, because children are careless, they'll blow it up. So that's why why Menaka doesn't have enough money. Okay. So, and number of young people is very small. Today in Japan you won't find young people. You'll find only people about the age of 60, 70, old people. So I tell all my young people, students, wherever you go, but don't go to Japan. Because there are no young people there for you to marry. There are only old people there. So that is the story. Japan, whatever it does now, cannot grow economically. Because there is nobody to consume. There's nobody to produce. They're running into manpower shortages. So Japan for the last 10 years has been growing at 1%, 0.5%. And that will be the Japanese rate of growth. There's nothing to do with Japanese people or their abilities. It is just that you come to a situation when you can't grow anymore. Now compare that with China and India. That's China there, and this is India. This is only till 2030. Look at how China begins to age here. That pagoda is moving upwards. Number of people above the age of 60 has gone up. The economists call that the dependency factor. When you say a country's dependency factor is going up, that means it is going to slow down in economic growth. And look at India. It's nice and fat and happy. It's growing merrily. Now these are the population projections. I won't go into details. All it shows you is that 60 plus age group in China will be 26% in 2030, and 60 plus age group will be 18% in 2050 in India. And this is 15 to 60. China will have only 55% and India will have 61%. And this is the favorable dependency ratio. This is China is the blue line coming down. India, the blue line, the dependency ratio is coming down. China is the green line going up. And Italy, why did I put Italy? It was the Congress time, so I put Italy. Italy is going up. So, working age increase in India, you can see the line on top, the blue line, working people increasing very rapidly. China is declining. China will not have workers, enough workers. So there's one reason why it needs to shift production to India, so that Chinese companies can produce goods in India. Now this is what we call the dependency ratio. India's dependency ratio hits the stride in 2020, where it suddenly becomes much better than China's. So that means that China will slow down abruptly, India will grow very suddenly, very fast. Which means that working population in India will increase in this period, 2010 to 2020, by 140 million, whereas it will only increase in China by about 20 million. That is the magic of demography, that things change. You don't have people, you can't grow. Europe is declining, Europe is stagnating, Europe is declining. But in the whole of Western Europe, England, France, Germany, Scandinavia, all will have reduced population by 2050. Russia will lose 50 million people by 2050. No population, no people. They will need people from our parts of the world to go and look after them. So India's working age group will increase dramatically from in 2000 to by 2050 by as much as 80%, whereas China will be stagnating at 25%, Japan will come down, Europe will start coming down, and USA will also be growing. USA is an interesting country. USA encourages people to migrate, young people to migrate, qualified, skillful people. So it keeps growing, and it keeps growing comfortably, and it keeps growing with people who can contribute to it. Now this is what we call India's late surge. It begins somewhere around the bottom, around between now and 2020. And that late surge will be the biggest expansion of the middle class the world has known till now, adding 180 million new families to the middle class. So add 5 to a family, is 900 million people coming into the middle class. 900 million people, refrigerators, motor cars, scooters, television sets, electricity, houses, bijli, pani. They don't want to eat chapatis anymore, they want to eat bread. They don't want to eat sabzi anymore, they want to eat chicken. So all that means more consumption, So when you keep going up, it means consumption goes up, and that consumption is what the world is interested in. Why is America interested? Why is Japan interested? You asked me the question. Why is America interested? Why is Japan interested? Why is China interested? It's in the demography. It is the output of the Indian woman which is leading to the world taking interest in us. It's the biggest expansion of the middle class. And then when the middle class expands, that means the country is growing economically. When you urbanize, when you get a middle class, that means you're growing. So whenever you go back to Tibet, you all must urbanize and increase your middle class to be prosperous. And you have a land which is endowed with a lot of wealth, natural resources. I'm sure you all can do it when it happens. Now this is the population of countries going up. As you see, the numbers keep changing. The largest increase from 1950 to 2000 was China, 720 million people. And the largest increase from 2000 to 2050 is India, 514 million people. So the importance is, if you have increase in population, you must send them to school, you must train them, you must keep them in good health, you must educate them, and then you must create jobs. If you don't create jobs, to create jobs you need investment. Investment means money. If you don't have the money, then somebody else's money. Which is the urgency why India needs China, Japan, others with money, to come saying, put your money here and we will give you a rate of return. And therefore India will say that we will show you a stable government, a stable regime, where your money is safe, you will get your money back, please invest here. So, as it is, India has more income inequality than China. China has more income inequality than India. India has more poverty than China. Now I'm going to rush through because this is what our friend, the previous General Secretary said. Regarding history as a mirror, we can understand what will be rising and what will be falling. Now this is the map of the graph of the world in the year 1000. Blue line is India, red line is China. India was the world's biggest economy. I told you about 1620, 1640. Both China and India and Western Europe are together, bundled up together. Then comes the drop of India and China in 1950 to the bottom. So in the world, people are going up and people are coming down. It's like the waves of an ocean. Nobody is rising together at the same time. You rise differently. So China grew last decade, the decade before, fine. They're growing this decade. Next decade will be somebody else. These are the ebbs and tides of history. Red is China, and the yellow one is India. So what do the economists say? Pricewaterhouse says that the top 10 countries by 2030 will be China, followed by US and India. Japan, India has already passed Japan. The current 10 are US, Japan, China. India growing faster, India and China both are growing faster than forecasted. Whatever they said we will grow at, we are actually doing much more than that. I'll leave these charts behind, Acharya ji, you all use them whenever you want. Now what is happening is the tortoise is now becoming into the hare. We started the race slowly, but now the tortoise is now becoming like the rabbit, running fast. And India could therefore grow faster than China. India will certainly overtake China by 2040 in GDP terms. Now you might find it unbelievable at this stage. But when I came back from America, the turnover of General Motors was more than the GDP of India. The turnover of General Motors was bigger than the GDP of India. Nobody at that stage could have said that India's GDP will be $2 trillion in real terms and $6 trillion in PPP terms. These are astounding figures. This is the end of the decade. Now this is something. Now this is the GDP growth rates I've been telling you. The green line, India, till 2050 will be the fastest growth rate. This is by the famous Goldman Sachs report. And this is how far behind India is. India fell behind China. How far we are behind on different aspects. This is life expectancy, 73, 65. That means we are 34 years behind. Will take us 34 years to come to that life expectancy. Child mortality, we are 32 years behind. So you keep going down. We are only on par with China in number of cars we have. Okay. Uh, so this is the top GDPs in the world now, and this is India's growth trend. And this is how Goldman Sachs is predicting that China will be 44 trillion, EU will be 35 trillion, USA 35, India 27. Is it 2050? But many people are saying that India will be more than. This is how they will look. Now this is Citibank. Citibank has said that India will overtake the US, China will overtake the US to become the largest economy by 2020 and then be overtaken by India in 2050. This is the projection they have. India has already overtaken Japan. Now China today is why is China important? Why is the world scared of China? Because it is the leading trading partner for most of the big countries, if not the number one, the number two. And as percentage of world's exports are going up. But China is running out of time. It's really running out of time. And number of old people is increasing, number of young people is coming down. China is in bad trouble. Now, are they listening to Comrade Xi Jinping who says, I have more children? No, because they are encountering a good thing. When people get wealthy, when you have a middle class, you have a house and a car and a refrigerator, you don't want to have more kids. You spoil the fun. More kids means you're looking for security in old age. When you feel assured that your life is going to be long and comfortable, you don't want to have kids. So China will not grow. The leadership might order it to grow, it won't grow. What it does to the minorities in China, I don't know. I have not studied it, but I have a feeling that the minorities will grow faster, as it is happening in India. The poorer people, the tribal people, the minorities, all are growing faster than the upper class Hindus. It's a very clear sign of China's slowdown here. Production capacity has gone up, deliveries is coming down, inventory is piling up. Yeah.
Okay.
This is it. What do we do? Where do we go next? Now this quick rundown on this. This is something which you all must understand as Tibetans. This is from Tibetan airfields. Tezpur is 325 kilometers, Guwahati 355 kilometers, Bagdogra 381, Jorhat 430, Chabua 455. That means a Chinese plane can take off from Tibet and come and into the Indian heartland and go back. And when we go and attack the Chinese base, it is in Tibet. It's a Tibetan base in Tibet. The world will say Bagdogra is near Darjeeling, Darjeeling attacked, or Calcutta attacked, or Delhi attacked. But when we go and attack Konghar, they'll say, well, something near Khotan was attacked in the middle of the desert. So we don't have counter value targeting. So it's not easy for us to fight with China. We have to then go further up into China and into the Indian Ocean. So this is the relevance of airfields in the Lhasa complex. They're only 170 kilometers from the border. So after you come over the border, you're down into the Indian heartland. So this is a difficult situation for us. Look at the airfields in China. They're all here. Distances. And look at how China has the inside line. It's like that. So what happens is, from there you can send troops either direction, whereas we have to go around. It's strategically not a good situation. So India will try as far as possible not to get into a fight with China. But if it gets into a fight, it's going to grow up very fast. That means you tell the Chinese, you want to fight, the price will be very high. We are not going to fire back with you at one, you fire one rifle, we fire one rifle. You fire with one rifle, we'll come at you with a machine gun. So the price will be, and we might lose in the long run, but the price will be too high, so it will cost you also more. So that is the new strategy which we are looking at. And for more, you should buy my book. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your enlightening and very analytical, data-filled presentation. If I may ask you a few questions.
Sure.
Because you started your presentation by your days at Stanford, and an economist told you that by 2000, his projection was that Connaught Place will fill with poor people,
Dead people.
poor and dead people. But it did not. Similarly, now you're projecting, as an economist, 2020 or 2050, where India's, with the democratic advantages that India has, it will only grow, and China, having the dependency demographic, by 2020 will only decline. But then that's in number and in data. But then if it's simply demography or resources, then Africa as a continent has more population and more resources than any continent in the whole world. So by your projection, Africa should be the most developed country.
When we say it will grow, it should have the potential.
Yes.
So we say India has the highest potential. So you could get into bad habits. It's like, two brothers. We're growing up together. You're older than me. And you finish college first. Then I finish after you. You go get married. Then you buy a car, and then you buy a big house. And I'm following you. So I could do the same thing. I could get a job, get married. But I could then also take to going to horse races. I could take to drinking. I can spend my money somewhere else. So it's a question of countries also take bad habits. So India has to watch for bad habits. Therefore, the profligacy, which we've shown, current account deficits, spending too much of money, has to stop. And I think the first stage is that this government has begun to move in that direction of controlling the profligacy. Second is you must educate people. You must send them to school. You must skill them. You must upskill them. If you don't upskill them, nothing's going to happen. You're going to have mouths to feed. But people are an asset. You can't take people as a problem. If there is somebody, you've got to train that person, you've got to educate him, you've got to skill him, you've got to give him a job. So even if you skill him, it's not enough. You have to give him a job. For a job, you need investment. For investment, you need money. So you're coming back to that cycle. So therefore, we are all betting on India getting the investment. So therefore, which is why China becomes important and Japan becomes important.
I think, as you said, I think the leadership is needed, governance is needed, infrastructure is needed, because India and China, as you said, by 1970, India had higher GDP than in China. But for these things, I think China's growth rate has increased.
Because it had a demographic profile to sustain growth. If you don't have you might have the best thing, if you don't have the demographic profile, you won't grow. There must be people to consume, people to produce, and people to save. That is the basic law.
Now, I think the audience will be more interested to know about Tibet-related issues. There's one issue I think you addressed at the beginning. More investment for India from China does not necessarily mean more friendship with China, because India will look at it simply from the transactional point of view. You're investing because you're profiting from us, and India will look more as a customer, as a client. I'll buy because your product is good, and that will be the relationship, and nothing more than that.
Absolutely, because sometimes you have no choice on where you're going to invest. When Japan was becoming expensive wage-wise, it had no choice but to go to put it in China, because Chinese workers were available cheap. But China has got money. Money cannot sit idle. It has to go and earn. It has to work like other people. So it has to come to a place where it can work. In India, it works.
But then I think we are, in fact, witness, in some way, victim of this analysis in the sense more China had economic relationship with the US. Their voice and their stand on human rights and Tibet and other issues declined considerably. So did the European countries. So European countries did not look at China as a market or simply as a transactional, but rather there was a deeper relationship. But then the way Chinese manipulate the whole thing, by putting so much pressure. For example, Norway has in fact zero dependency on China's economy. Even they don't need a penny from China because they always have 10% surplus as far as the GDP is concerned. In fact, their problem is where to spend and invest the surplus, and they're investing in sovereign fund in different countries. Only thing they have is the salmon export. The salmon is so good they can sell it anywhere, but for a few $1 million, I think Norway came under tremendous pressure, and because of the pressure, after Liu Xiaobo was granted Nobel Peace Prize, and simply during his solemn visit recently, and on human rights issues, even Norway is coming under pressure because of China's economy and because of China's political strength. Now, will that not be one progression vis-a-vis India as well?
That's why right at the beginning I said two things. I said India will not fight with China over Tibet. One. Second thing I said that Tibetans must do what they think is their duty. It's an important lesson. That throughout history, big countries do not stick their necks out for small countries. Small countries will have to do their duty, what it takes to keep that candle burning. History has a way of equalizing. But you have to, and that only Tibetans can do. Indians can't do it for you. I can't sit here and keep jumping and shouting because I'll have no credibility. But Tibetans do it by their own experience, by their own efforts, and by portraying conditions in Tibet. So you can constantly keep troubling our conscience, and that is your job. That is your job to do it. But if India has a responsibility to Indians, if you don't get their money, we will have hundreds and millions of people who are going to be suffering and without jobs and at the end of the day, Prime Minister, you are only 200,000 in India.
100,000 in fact. 100,000.
Well, yeah, 150,000, and I think there is a floating population coming in. But thereabout. But end of the day, there are 150, 200 million people in India who need jobs. We need to create 12 million jobs a year. 12 million jobs a year. That is our demographic push. For 12 million jobs, you can imagine how much of investment you need. And if you don't create the 12 million jobs, then those fellows will be on the street. And what will they do on the street? They will agitate and they'll bring the government down. They'll bring disorder in society. So, we are also on escalator going up. We can't go down. We got to run fast to go up.
And now one issue has come up regarding the border. Then we'll open up the question regarding, let's say, Aksai Chin and Arunachal issue, whether they be quid pro quo or not.
I don't think there'll be a quid pro quo because the Chinese have offered it several times. The Chinese have offered it in 63, to Rajiv Gandhi in 87, to Narasimha Rao when he went, Jiang Zemin offered it. But we have a problem. In India, we have internalized in our head that Aksai Chin was taken from us. The reality is that we were never in Aksai Chin. But we believe that it was taken from us. And in Parliament, the political price will be too high for any government to say, okay, I've agreed to give Aksai Chin away. Okay. But now the issue of Tawang has come up. From the issue of Tawang, Chinese have said Arunachal Pradesh is also mine. The whole Arunachal Pradesh. So, India is not about to give up anything. So that will therefore be a bone of contention. All the Chinese and Indians have agreed is that keep that aside now, let history sort it out. Meantime, we hope that your history will sort it out also. And that the candle you've been burned will catch flame somewhere. So, history has a way of equalizing in the long run. Nothing gets sorted out. Today, I might be strong, I might go and attack China and do something. But tomorrow I might be weak, China will attack me. So this attacking doesn't solve anything. We have to let events fall into place.
So with that, we'll open the floor for questions. Anyone would like to ask a question?
There's no one else. You talk about urbanization at the beginning, and in Tibet we see that the nomad areas are getting under pressure. There's this economic development, there are mines open, and people are put in some other place, and lots of problems. Now, do you have any advice? You know the current situation in Tibet. What kind of economic strategy should the Tibetans inside Tibet follow? Should they really stick to their homelands in the nomad areas, or rush into the cities and try to become urban Tibetans? Or do you have any ideas on that?
You see, as people get educated and people get upskilled, they'll go where the jobs are. You know, you're not going to be herders anymore. You know, while you go on the train from Jining to Lhasa, you see people in camps, herding camps and, with motorcycles. But they're not going to want to do that forever. People want what they think are better jobs. They want to work in a factory or want to work in an office. People are going to move. That tendency you can't halt. Even in India you see that. The minute you get educated, you want to leave your village. You don't want to work on the fields. Today you don't get a farm labor in India. If you have a farm, you won't get labor because all the young people have gone to work in cities, pursuing their fortune. And so, there's nothing you can tell people to do. People will do what they want and what is in their interest. As far as ripping up the countryside is concerned, I think we do a good job of it in India also. Take out iron ore, take out coal, take somebody else's land. Because that has become the norm of behavior now. So, if China is doing it, we're also doing it. But that is the Australians have done it, Americans have done it, everybody does it. Because we can challenge the philosophical basis of this growth model. But as long as we are sitting on this growth model, then you can't have both. You can't have a pastoral environment and then, and also a good life. It just doesn't happen. When you are becoming wealthy, when you're consuming more, you're using up more energy, you're using up more resources, you're taking it away from the earth. So you are polluting the air. Every time you drive a car, you're polluting the air. So who is going to stop? Now, for Gandhiji told us that this is all bad, you shouldn't do it. But did it stop us? If today I say, no, please go back to the village and, milk your cow and sit there, will people listen? We are all, it's a philosophical question I think only somebody like His Holiness can address. I can't address an economist. I say, I can only show how to grow it.
Now, I think the issue is, as per Human Rights Watch report, around 2 million Tibetan herders or nomads were forced to settle in ghetto-like situation where, they are put in no man's land with no prospect for economic growth. So they are forced to settle.
I don't know enough about the Tibet situation, but certainly in India, it's not forced. People tell you it's better to be in a slum in Delhi than to be in some godforsaken village in Vidarbha. That is the reality. There's no water, there's no electricity, there's nothing. So we want to come to a town and work here, where you get a wage at the end of 30 days. We don't know if the rains are going to come, whether you'll be eating anything. So it all depends where you are.
I just wanted to not directly related to Tibet, but I think you gave a very good analogy of drug peddler, the relationship between China and US, that of a drug peddler and a drug addict. Do you think that kind of scenario could be for India in the future, if India does invite so much of investment from China, and China will have a much bigger say in what? That's one question. And then I was wondering, between China and Japan, who do you think would be the bigger partner, a bigger trading partner for India? And the third one, the third question I wanted to ask was, you were saying that the demographic is what India has, the demographic asset. So what is in India you see that the minorities are growing at a much bigger rate, right? So is
Not
that
not minorities. I think poor people.
and minorities?
Who
Minorities.
quite often are tribal people are they're poor. That's why they're
So
growing.
what should be the policy on that from the government side? And because I do feel when I'm in Delhi, people often just talking about why they should not go, that they have this bigger conspiracy, agenda and all that. So how do you view that? And then going back to Tibet, where my colleague was saying that, I think from your eyes as an economist or as a political economist, I think you see urbanization as something that's inevitable, whether it's under occupation or in a free country. So we as Tibetans, we're always kind of trying to champion the cause of, people living as nomads against the railway. So how do you view all that? So I just wanted to hear.
There's so many questions in there. So
So many questions.
what was the first one you started off with?
Drug peddling. and
Drug
drugs.
peddling. Drug peddling. No, you see, there's an old saying that if you owe the bank $10,000, the bank owns you. And if you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. Okay? Now, China's investment will lock it into India. Like Japanese investment has locked it into China. Can Japan take it back? They're throwing stones at Japanese cars, and can it take it back? You can't. Because you can't shut down a railway and go. If you shut it down, I'll take it over. So, so it's not the same thing. When you talk about drug peddler and the analogy for consumption, this is not money coming for consumption. This is money coming for investment. So it's very
So
different.
will that happen?
It won't happen. It won't happen. It will never. To get India addicted, the Chinese have to put a few $1 trillion. I don't think even they have that kind of money to spare. So that's one. The second thing was
Japan, China.
Japan, China. Who do we prefer? We don't really prefer anybody. Money is the same. Is your money, his money, is money. So why should I prefer Japanese money over Chinese money and vice versa?
No, I didn't ask preference. I said who would be the bigger partner?
China would certainly be bigger. Because China is more risk taking. Japan is more risk averse traditionally. Now, and Japan is not growing also. Japan doesn't really have the drive and push to take risks outside. China is very risk taking, great ability. The Chinese is a national character also. They gamble all the time and they're always taking chances. So China will certainly be much bigger and they have more money to spare. Bigger than Japan in any case. But we will hedge one against the other. He went to Japan, came back, he comes here, then he goes to America, comes back. So we are engaged into an era of bilaterals. So we tell the Chinese, my relationship with Japan is Japan and me, it doesn't concern you. And we tell the Japanese, my relationship with China is between China and India, it doesn't concern you. We say the same thing to Americans. That is what is non-alignment, that we act separately with different people.
Minorities in the group.
You see, minorities, that is the tragedy of life and the reality. You the poor people in India, the tribals particularly, the area on which I write a lot and I work a lot, get extremely left behind because their backwardness also results in bad leadership. And then the state is also an organic animal. Nobody wants to go and run a school in a village. Teachers don't want to go there, doctors don't want to go there. So they're getting left behind. And the poorer areas is where the forests and the mountains are, is where the minerals are. In the folds of the mountains, the tectonic plates moved, minerals went into the folds of the mountains. So, you go and mine and drill there. So you come into conflict there. Muslims lost their complete leadership when migrated to Pakistan, left the poor Muslims behind. And the poor Muslim is now being fed with jihad and madrasas. So when he comes out of a madrasa, he's not fit for a job. Now, when you get to tell them that don't go to madrasa, go to a school, then you have a problem. Because our own people say that you can't interfere with their practices. So there are all kinds of issues when you live in an open society. In China, it's all very different. You say no madrasas, no madrasas. We can't do that. We have to actually only take the camel to the water, can't force it to drink.
Here we have one question.
Good to see you, sir, because I'm a Facebook follower.
Really?
And I had the privilege of honor of inviting you to one of the leadership training 10 years back.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Losing Issue. And we've been going through your papers, and we learn a lot from what the research papers that you produce. And the good thing about your papers is that you've been very truthful, very straightforward, sometimes very uncomfortable, but we are learning a lot. But today I would like to take this opportunity to raise certain concerns that some young Tibetans have, especially about some of your writings. 2 months back, I have written a paper called Spanshil, Academic, or something like that. It concerns about when we raise the issue of Sino-India border, Tibetan issue comes in between. And in many of your writings regarding India-China border issue, there is always a statement about Tibetans not recognizing the McMahon line way back in 1947. And in many of your articles, I've just...
Even in my book.
Yes, many of your book. In 2009, your paper, Sino-Indo Ties, 20th Century Border for the Stable 21st Century, you mentioned about the same statement that really bothers us. You have written about how Tibetans have not recognized the Tawang as a part of India way back in 1947, and I quote, in 1947, the Dalai Lama, the same gentleman who is now in Dharamsala, sent the newly independent India a note laying claims to some districts in Nepal and Arunachal Pradesh. That was one. And in 2009, in one of your writings in Outlook magazine, long-lived sibling rivalry, the same thing you have mentioned. The present Dalai Lama led way to this China's claim over Arunachal Pradesh was formally taking claim over Taiwan, located below McMahon line in 1947. Similarly, in one of your Facebook status, especially before the taking over of Tawang by Mr. Kading, in June 1st, 2011, we have also mentioned the same thing in 1947, the Dalai Lama claimed Tawang. And in the following sentence, you also mentioned about it was only in 2006 that the Tibetan government accepted Tawang as a part of India. Similarly, your seminar presentation in 2010, August 11, titled India-China Border Dispute Way Ahead, that was held in Center for Land Warfare Studies, along with Shrikant Kandavaliji and General Pai. You mentioned the same thing in 1947, the Dalai Lama, the same gentleman who is now in Dharamsala and newly independent. But we would request your Honor, sir, if possible, if you could not mention the name of Dalai Lama, because we feel that he was just minor, 12 years old in 1947. So then the independent Tibet was ruled by the regent Takrur Rinpoche. So he was the man in the Kashak and the Zongdu, that is the National Assembly. So they make the decision in 1947 not to respond to the Indian overture. Actually, it took 6 months, but then they did respond it. So after 6 months, the Tibetan government in Lhasa accepted and acknowledged the Simla Treaty. So they have allowed the new Indian government to have an embassy in Lhasa. They have the trade agents in Gardok and Yangtze and Yatung. So everything was fine after that. Everything was fine after that. So regarding whenever there is a seminar in Delhi or anywhere else, the question always comes up that our Indian brothers seem to have a doubt about our, political stand on Taiwan. So in many seminars, this was, made clear because when His Holiness arrived in Taiwan on the 30th March 1959, he respected the McMahon line and didn't cross over until the Indian, entourage official came to receive him. So that was a sign that he has, respected the McMahon line. So in 1997 also, when he had an interview with Cloud RPT, he also said that yes, back then Tibetans did committed a mistake. We should have recognized early on. And then in 2004, there was a Buddhist World Seminar in Turabura. There also he acknowledged the same thing. So there were many incidents that the Tibetan government in exile has recognized the Simla agreement and has adopted according to that. So I would request you to, in future, if possible, whenever you mention in 1947 incidents about the Lhasa government, if you could change that into the Tibetan government, because His Holiness was just 12 years old. He took the political authority only in April 23rd, I think, or 27th in 1950. So only then he took charge, and there also he took charge 6 months earlier than the normal tradition. So
Yeah,
it
but
would be
you know-
proper factually to mention Lhasa government rather than His Holiness the Dalai Lama when you mention about government's,
Certainly.
mistakes. Because I've heard that this mistakes has caused us a lot. It seems to have we have lost initial sympathy for us in the Indian leadership, especially from Nehru and others. And the second question I would like to raise here, if I could, because it's a golden chance. Although I thought of interacting with Facebook, but I thought maybe in person to person. So today is a good chance for me. One concern was you have responded to one of your friends called Manas in Facebook. And it was regarding the rivalry between India and China being produced by many Western interests. And you have mentioned here, I'll quote, Manas, there's a big Western interest in India, partly spurred by the Tibetan exiles, partly by pro-US elements, and partly by the ultra-nationalists, to put us, that is India, on a collusion course with China. So you have blamed the Tibetan exiles partially responsible for the rivalry that India has with China. And China and India is inevitably the rivals, but that doesn't mean that we must whip ourselves into a frenzy all the time. Policy must not be dictated by falsehood and small minds. That you have responded in 2011, June 15, 3:42 a.m. So that is also a big concern because we've been blamed whenever we travel all over India. Sometimes the question crops up from different people that Tibet has been responsible for the 62 war. So we've been blamed for the acute rivalry that today exists between India and China. So I think it's not very justifiable. So that's one thing. And the last thing, I've just recently read one of your latest analytical report that started India's Tibet option in July 1st. There you have, through the conclusion, you have given 10 guidelines for India to have a policy on Tibet. Of the 10, 8 were very nice, very appropriate and correct, and it's a really visionary. But I was a little bit concerned about the 2 of the points that you have given, and it really makes us uncomfortable. The 2 two more points is that India not allowed Dalai Lama space to assume the leadership of all Buddhists in India. That's one point. I believe His Holiness has always maintained his neutrality and has never endeavored to become the leader of all Buddhists in India. So that would not, be proper statement. And the second point, the Tibetans born in India are gradually integrated into mainstream Indian society. So it's a little bit concern for us because we have been maintaining our separate identity in order to, sustain our movement here in exile. But I certainly like the last point that India must play more active role in encouraging dialogue with China and the Tibetan leadership. So these are some of the concerns that we have. I have been concerned about this for the last 5-6 years and thought of really correcting the factual things. But today is a good time for me.
Good.
If I have been blunt, I will.
No, but I will also be.
Thank you so much.
I will also be blunt. I'm glad you corrected it because, first of all, I have to look at things from an Indian perspective. I don't have to look at it from your perspective, and I cannot. Okay. Now the fact is, the historical fact is, the letter from the Dalai Lama. And when we say letter from the Sikyong, we don't really mean him, it means the government. It means that the collective decision was taken by the Regency or whatever to stake claim to Tawang and surrounding areas. This is what the Chinese tell us now in negotiations. That we are not wanting this, this is a desire of the Tibetans. And mind you, it took us till 2009 to make the Tibetan government in exile recant from that position. And that happened in the ORF conference room when Lodi Gyari was there. And Lodi Gyari then stood up and said, I have, or 2007 I think, I don't know, I have the authority of the Dalai Lama to say that that was a mistake, it is no longer the case. That we repudiate that claim. So that was the basis of the Chinese claim for Tawang. Now the Chinese claim for Arunachal Pradesh is on the basis of some Ming court map. Okay? So that is a historical fact. You cannot repudiate that. And I would be guilty as a scholar if I try to hide that. If I put facts, I even quote Professor Gay, who says that, Tibet, to consider Tibet always as a part of China is also wrong, as a Chinese. In China they may not allow him to speak, but I quote him. That Tibet was independent, that Tibet was a separate country, it had its ups and downs, but it acted independently at the time. India was independent, and then from 1913 to 45 years, Tibet was de facto independent. We accept that. So there's nothing wrong. Sometimes history comes to revisit us. We've done things in the past which revisit us. The second issue which you raised was?
About the Tibetans being producing the collision course.
True, a lot of data comes out. Every time there's on the water issues. Now if you look at the Sangmo project, the Tibetan sources will always tell you that it is water being taken away. Well, it's a run of the river Heidel project. The Pakistanis accused us of the same thing on Jhelum. When we built a run of the river project, the Pakistanis say you are taking away our water. When run of the river means that the treaties allow you to use the water but not take it away. So the Chinese are using the water, and it is our position on Jhelum, which is their position on the Brahmaputra. But yet it keeps appearing from certain people who I know, I don't want to mention, like Claude R.P. will write, that took away. And there will be a hullabaloo in India. Monu Nalapat will write and saying that our water is going away. So you see, therefore, it puts us in a difficult situation. Because we have to argue. I had to do presentations along with B.G. Varghese to show that this is not the case. That that we may not be getting hydrological data from China as much as we want on the Sutlej and the what is that, Lanchen Khamba river, which is Sutlej, I think. But that is different from putting false stories into our media. Into our media, we can always put false stories. There was this well-known case, of a rock on the border with a painted sign. And the Indian newspapers all said, this written by Chinese, saying that this is Chinese territory. Instead of Middle Kingdom, the person who wrote it wrote Middle River Kingdom. Now, any Chinese PLA soldier will know how to spell his country's name. And there was a hullabaloo in India. We get all whipped up into frenzy. We get angry, what are the Chinese doing? We want to. So, this is something which it is in your interest to be careful with data. When people are trying to manipulate, and then we realize you're getting manipulated, there's a reaction. Okay, so that is the second point I'd like to make. That when you have a point, it should be based on facts, not misleading. Okay, that's the third one was on.
It's about the 10 guidelines that you have in just Tibet.
Yeah, now look, I'm again an Indian. Now, I did a study of the monasteries on the Himalayan region. And we find that 120 of the monasteries have been now controlled by Tibetans. Now, our people are not very different from the Ladakhis and the people in Arunachal and all, not very different from Tibetans. There are people on both sides. But tomorrow you become free. Okay? Will I leave you a residual claim in Ladakh? I have to be careful, right? I'm not leaving any markers in history. So we have to be aware of that. Now, certainly Tibetan Buddhism is one sect of Buddhism. It is not the Buddhism which we were taught and which originated here. It's certainly Sri Lankan Buddhism. Tomorrow, would we want some Thero from Sri Lanka to be leader of our Buddhists? These are issues you must look at it sensitively from a nationalist Indian perspective. We're not saying that, push the Tibetans out. Nobody says that. Nobody in India says that. We say you have to give them help, give them hospitality, give them the respect that is due. But on the other hand, we have to also be careful about lines. Because, what has happened in West Bengal, we allowed migration to come in. Today, out of the 9 border districts, 40% are Bangladeshi. So, these are a marker for history. Tomorrow, 50 years down the line, they'll say we want to join Bangladesh. Because the people are born there, they have a citizenship claim, they have a sovereign right. So, that paper originally, which got published, I don't know how it got published, it was a top secret document meant for the government. Okay? And if I don't advise my government according to my convictions, who will I advise? I've told you bluntly that if you want independence, you have to fight. But I will not give you a gun to fight. You go and get yourself a gun, I might look the other side. But if you say that, don't do this, don't say these things, how can I not say this to my government? My job is to put everything very bluntly, straightforward. This is. In all my papers, you'll read, in all my books, everything is, all points of view are provided in it. There's a Tibetan point of view, a Chinese point of view, Indian point of view, Congress point of view, BJP point of view, every point of view is there. And then we have to take a position from that. So, I don't think it should cause too much of offense. You must take it for what it's worth. But I'll keep it in mind,
With that note, I think we will end here. But just to add one point regarding 120 monasteries that you went to the Himalayan border areas. From our side, we see as a contribution to India, mainly because if these monasteries don't get what we call the Tibet experience, people in the borders, I also went to Kakshung borders, nomads I went to Arunachal, Tuting, Geling village I went. People in the border areas, the uncle is on the other side, his daughter-in-law is from this side. For them, the border, Magmon line, whatever the boundary we call it, doesn't mean much. If there's a major snowstorm, let's say in the border areas, if you get animal feed from the other side, you go to the other side. If you get blanket from other side, you go to the other side. Now if you get oil from this side, you come this side. That's border areas. Now, only way India can defend border is through hard power, because this new border that has come out, as you said, Tawang in 1951, the claim was made. Now, only way these people in the border areas can have this soft power, which draws a line, is what we call Tibet experience. Now, with all these monasteries, educated and trained by Tibetan monks, when they go back, one thing, yes, they revive their own age-old tradition, that's Tibetan Buddhism, but they go with Tibet experience. In that sense, they look at the other side of the border with deep suspicion because they know what happened to Tibet. Who is the real threat to the monasteries? Not India, but the other side.
No, the point I made
Yes.
is very different. The point I made is that you will become a Tibet one day. And there are territories here which you would have changed completely. Okay, that is the only point I'm making. Therefore, from the Government of India point of view, we have to be careful. And
But-
from an Indian perspective, that is the correct perspective.
Now,
Okay, now I can give you a list of the 120 monasteries. You know, I've got it at home. I can send it to you. But these are, when you take it long-range issues, you look at history and how it unfolds, you have to factor all this in. Tomorrow you will do it in Tibet. Suppose if, like I gave you this Bangladesh border case now. 50 years from now, we will not have a case when people ask for, on the basis of religion, they want a larger state, we won't have a case.
but from our side, our interpretation, our understanding of border has been, we never needed an Indian border post, policemen to guard the border. It was a free-flow border. Tawang case, the Magmon line, all this came up after the invasion of Tibet. So from our side, we have always looked at that way. So I think you're a little bit more skeptical. You've been more economists and geostrategists than the Indian, I would
You
say.
know, I went into Bangladesh
Yes.
in 71. I was a young man, took part in some of the things. I have seen change Bangladesh attitude. You know, things change. So, you know, it is not, Ronald Reagan once said that trust is important, but verification is more important. You know, so we have to trust you, but we have to verify. Okay? So I think, therefore, you know, countries have to be careful in the long run, because, you know, the notion of territory and all is very clear.
Okay. So for more discussions in the future and for more visits in the future, I think we'll end our speech and very engaging debate. So we have just shown you one. We have 9 others who have read all your papers, analyzed. We will come with analysis next time.
On
So
the-
we're just giving you a sample.
On the internet, we call them trolls. So I'm being trolled by Tibetans.
Yes. So
Chinese troll me, incidentally. When I go to China, same things happen. You said this, you know.
So that's very good. So thank you very much for everybody, especially to Mohan Guru Swamiji for coming all the way from Delhi to Dharamsala and back to Delhi, then but soon to come back to Dharamsala again. So with that note, please give him a big hand and thank you.